Well, let's talk more then about these US tariffs that have had a stinging effect right across the globe. Markets from Asia to Europe and in the US opening much lower today. South Africa has also not been spared. This country facing a 30% tariff as per Donald Trump's announcement last week. Let's bring in Lord Peter Hain to talk about all of this. A very good evening to you, Lord Hain. Thank you so much for being on SABC News. So are these tariffs by the Trump administration, are they the global wrecking ball that some economists say they are?
Yes, I think so. We've already seen, as you just reported, and I listened in to China, President Trump retaliating against China after China retaliated against him. These are the two big giants of the world economy. And what we saw in the 1920s and the 30s is that kind of retaliation escalating into a full-scale trade war. And we saw living standards collapse and world trade collapse by over half. This is a very dangerous road we're going down, or at least President Donald Trump is leading us down.
Is there anyone who can intervene, who can stop this, or is it ultimately going to come down to individual countries or blocs like the EU, for instance, now having to request those meetings with the White House and see if they can strike deals?
Well, the EU, the European Union's already said that it will retaliate against the 25% tariffs that Trump has, 20% tariffs Trump has levied on it, just as China has retaliated against the enormous tariffs Trump levied on China. So the European Union is the richest, biggest economy in the world, even bigger than China and the US. So these are the giants, the three of them together. If they start fighting each other in trade wars, there are going to be lots and lots of casualties, millions of casualties. But, maybe there can be negotiations, maybe there can be discussions. President Trump is prone to making big announcements as one of the self-styled big men of global politics, as he did saying he'd end the Ukraine war within the Russia invasion of Ukraine within a matter of days, and as he said he'd end the war in Gaza over a matter of days. Well, it's now weeks and weeks and weeks into his presidency, and neither's happened.
He also doesn't like pushback, Donald Trump, the US president, because in the last hour or so, after the Chinese imposed a tariff of 34% on US goods and products, he's now said that if they don't withdraw that, if China does not reverse that decision, the US will impose further tariffs of up to 50%. So if, for instance, the EU goes ahead with its own retaliation, what would the consequences be for the global economy? Is that why we would ultimately land up with a scenario where perhaps we might see scenes similar to the 1930 Great Depression, or a global recession, as some are warning, is possible?
Yes, the president is there, and I explained all this in my Daily Maverick online article this morning, that the 1920s and 1930s provide a grim and ominous precedent for where this all ends. If you start getting retaliation, and the European Union, as I said a few moments ago, is threatening retaliation, China has already implemented retaliation, and then Donald Trump is hitting back, saying if they don't back down, he will escalate things even more. Where's this going to end? It will end, if we're not careful, in a collapse in world trade, which happened in the 1930s of over half the level of world trade, a collapse in living standards. The Great Depression followed, and then the Second World War followed that. When you get these kind of enormous, convulsive economic earthquakes, sadly, war sometimes, if not always, follows. And I'm really worried about the situation in the current era, because we've seen after Vladimir Putin's invasion, his barbaric invasion of Ukraine, him saying that not only does he want to, in a kind of old-fashioned imperialist way, subjugate the Ukrainians and take over that country, and they're fighting back, understandably, but he won't stop there. He'll continue elsewhere in Europe. So Europe is facing on its borders a big threat from Russia, which has armed itself to the teeth. And then you've got in the middle of all this, Trump unleashing trade wars. It's a very worrying prospect, and South Africa won't be isolated or insulated from that.
On the point you're making about Europe and arming itself to the teeth here, it's looking at how, well, encouraging, in fact, member states to increase military spending after Trump said that the United States, as he had done in his previous term, was not interested basically in bankrolling NATO, the military alliance's budget. He's also not interested in helping to fund Ukraine in its attempts to fend off the Americans. But you also said something quite interesting in your piece in the Daily Maverick today, where you said that Donald Trump is basically a byproduct, a result of a broken global economic model. How so? And would his measures, his economic policy then, would that be able to mold the global economy in a way that is more fair to everyone around? Because what the Republicans have been trying to do in the last few days is say that even though the markets are taking a beating, it's a rich man's problem and the poor will ultimately benefit. The poor and the working class would benefit.
Well, that didn't happen in the 1930s. These trade wars have never benefited working people or those in the middle or bottom of society. By the way, I said Russia had armed itself to the teeth, not Europe, though Europe is having to respond by increasing its own national security spending. Germany's taken the unprecedented step post-Second World War of amending its constitution to enable it to borrow hundreds of millions of euros in order to increase its defense capability. Britain's increased its. Europe has taken a decision to increase their military spending through extra borrowing. So this is a situation, on the one hand, where the response to Vladimir Putin's aggression in Ukraine has been to increase military spending. And on the other hand, to pick up directly on your question, tariff increases producing retaliatory tariff increases, as we've seen with China and Russia, and China and the United States facing a standoff. Europe is the biggest single richest economy in the world, the bloc, the European Union bloc, ready to do the same. This is going to hit everybody. And the Great Depression of the 1930s was followed, of course, by the Second World War. And ordinary people were the casualty to that. This is not some rich man's problem, because stock markets have fallen right across the world, as the Trumpites are pretending. It is affecting everybody. And if the banks get infected by this, then we'll all be in danger with our savings and so on. I'm not saying that will necessarily happen, but it could.
If I may, sir, just very briefly, if you can, we saw rallies across the US on Saturday. Some of the people who took part in those demonstrations are against this raft of tariffs being implemented by Trump. Would domestic pressure by the ordinary rank and file in the US, is that what would ultimately put the brakes on Trump's plan if the poor and the working class say up to here and no further, because they are being affected?
I'm not sure, because President Donald Trump has a mandate, an enormous mandate from the last presidential election. And he has appealed to industrial workers who lost their jobs as a result of the neoliberal economic system that's been in existence for the last few decades. And that bears directly as an answer to your earlier question. We've seen massive inequality. We've seen the closure of motor car plants right across the Rust Belt in America, and that's happened elsewhere in industrially advanced economies, and they've been outsourcing everything. By the way, Elon Musk, the former South African, made himself a top American. His Tesla factory relies a lot on outsourcing, including to China, as is the modern way. What Trump is trying to do is promise industrial workers, industrial working class workers who voted, especially those who voted for him, deserting parties, progressive parties like the Democrats, which has also been happening right across Europe. He's promised them that tariffs, putting tariffs on competitor countries like China, will restore those industries. Well, let's see. I don't think that will happen quickly.
Lord Peter Hain, good to talk to you. Thank you so much for your time this evening on the SABC News channel.